Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming today. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Steve Hurd, joining us from the University of New Brunswick, where he's a professor. Some of you might know his work on forest insect population dynamics. He's currently the president of the Canadian Society of, I'm going to get the E's backwards, Steve, Ecology and Evolution, or is it Evolution and Ecology? Okay, good. So that's a fantastic meeting and a great group. If you're interested in attending their joint conference with the ESA, the other ESA, it's in Montreal in 2022. And of course, Steve is also an author. You might know this book, or also the one he's going to talk to us today about, Charles Darwin's Barnacle, David Bowie's Spider, How Scientific Names Celebrate Adventures, Heroes, and Scoundrels. Yeah, so I won't take any more of his time. I'll pass it right off. Looking forward to it.
Great, thanks, Brock. I'm going to put my screen share back up here. It looks like it even worked. So thanks for inviting me. It's going to be fun. And it's especially fun for me to talk to an entomology department, because that's more or less what I sort of am. Not that I'm going to talk about my actual entomological research today. Instead, I'm going to talk about species names. And this talk is based, as Brock mentioned, on a recent book of mine called Charles Darwin's Barnacle and David Bowie's Spider. So it's a book that finds stories and names, in particular in the scientific names of species that are named after people, David Bowie and many, many more. I think they're fascinating stories, and I hope you will too. And I think they tell us some interesting and important things about science and about scientists. Now, whoops, gotta get the slide advance thing here. There we go. You, of course, all know how our system of scientific naming works, and our basic system of Latinized genus and species names that was formalized by Linnaeus in the 1720s and 1730s. Since then, we've elaborated the rules quite a bit. For those of you who aren't systematists, I'll just very quickly mention a couple of things about this. The rules are not as complicated as people sometimes think, at least not the rules for how you come up with a name. And that's the part I'll talk about today. So if you're going to name a new species, there's a couple things you need to keep in mind, not very many. So first of all, genus and species names have to have at least 2 letters. So this flying dinosaur, Ichi, this is the shortest species name that you can ever have. It's also a really cute animal, so I like this one. Names need not be Latin in origin. We call these things Latin names. They're really Latinized names. They don't have to come from Latin, although once we make a name, we treat it grammatically as if it is, so that explains a lot of nonsense around the suffixes and the gender agreement of a genus and species and things like that we're not going to worry about today. And because they don't have to be Latin, they can come from all kinds of places, and they can come from other languages. And just as one example, this is Tiktaalik, the transitional amphibian from the Canadian Arctic that Neil Shubin discovered and has written so much about. Tiktaalik is named from an Inuktitut word, indigenous language of the area. It means burbot, which is a fish that looks a bit like this thing. Homo naledi, recent discovery in South Africa, comes from the Sotho word for star, which because the fossil was discovered in, and I've forgotten exactly, the cave of the rising star or something like that. So these names don't have to be Latin in origin. And even more than that, and this is important, you can even make a scientific name from an arbitrary combination of letters. And what that means is you have pretty free reign when you're making up a name for a species. And so just as an example of some of the more common categories where names come from, and again, I know this is very familiar to most of you, Latin names can be descriptive. So that blue warbler, Pseudophaga caerulea, caerulea just means blue. They can be geographical, quite common. Redbud tree, Cercis canadensis, ironically very rare in Canada. It's not a very good Latin name, only just squeezes into the very southern tip of Ontario. But anyway, that's its Latin name. But because of these, because they don't have to be descriptive, they don't have to refer to characteristics of the organism, you can do things like wordplay. So this is one of the smallest genera of frogs, smallest body size, not smallest diversity, from Madagascar, I think, and Mark Schertz has named this, and this is the species, a mini mum. And there's also a minuscule and a miniature and a few more like that, so you can have fun. But the names I'm going to talk about today are the ones that are formed from the names of people, so eponymous names, and that is David Bowie's Spider in all its orange glory. If you're old like me, you might remember David Bowie in his Ziggy Stardust phase, and you might agree that the long-legged, orange-haired spider named for David Bowie kind of hits the nail right on the head. But there are thousands of species like that, species named eponymously. These are a few. In each case, the red just picks out the person's name. Sometimes people are famous, like Bowie or like Charles Darwin. Sometimes the people are obscure, like Stan Blazimski, who I'll talk about in a minute, that gorgeous blue weevil. Each one of these names offers a story. So who named the species, who was the person they named it for, and why did they decide to coin that particular eponymous name? And I love digging into those stories. Some of those stories are funny. Some of them are infuriating. Some of them are poignant. I'm going to tell you a few of those stories today. What I want you to see is that the names of species open a window on the personalities and the quirks of the scientists who coined the names. You'll see creativity on display and virtue and vice when you start to poke into the stories and the people behind these names. And I'm going to start with one to make a point that sometimes you may know the Latin name very, very well and yet not even realize that it's eponymous. And that was how it was for me for a long time for the plant genus Magnolia in the lower right. I've known that name for years, but I had no idea there was a story behind it. And maybe you did, but I bet you there's at least somebody here who didn't know this, that Magnolia is named for this fellow. This is Pierre Magnol in the middle, underneath the hair. Magnol was a French botanist. He was born in 1638, and he published a few books that were pretty influential in the time, especially this one. The title translates roughly to a Prelude to a General History of Plants. In that book, Magnol arranged known species of plants into groups that we now call plant families. You'd recognize some of those groupings that he made. He was the first person to do it for plants. He did it about 50 years before Carl Linnaeus became famous for doing the same thing. And we'll get to Linnaeus later on. Now, of course, in arranging plants into families, Magnol was taking the first steps toward what I think we would all agree is the most important advance in all of biology. And that's that you can make those groupings because all species on Earth are related by evolution, by common descent. Magnol was working 200 years before Darwin. He didn't realize that, and for religious reasons, he probably would have been shocked if he had realized it. But his insights were brilliant anyway. And in 1703, another French botanist, Charles Plumier, discovered this beautiful flower in the West Indies, and he named it Magnolia as a way of honoring Magnol. When Plumier described or explained his choice of name, he wrote about Magnol. He wrote about the illustrious Pierre Magnol, counselor to the king, professor of the Academy of Physicians. It makes it seem like Magnol had it made. He was counselor to the king. Doesn't get much better than that, right? But that's pretty misleading. Magnol was not handed anything on a silver platter. It was quite the opposite. And that's because Magnol was a Huguenot. He was a member of the Protestant minority in Roman Catholic France. In Magnol's day, King Louis XIV was becoming more and more openly hostile to the Huguenots. He revoked a French law called the Edict of Nantes that protected Huguenot rights. He forced Huguenots to give room and board to his royal dragoons and a lot more. Huguenots like Magnol had three choices. They could leave their home in France. Many did, many fled. They could stay but live under active persecution, or they could convert to Catholicism. Magnol suffered discrimination and persecution for a long time. Despite this reputation as a brilliant scientist, he was passed over again and again for appointments excuse me, at universities. Eventually, he was forced to convert. Even at that, he was 56 years old before he finally got a professional appointment. And we think postdocs are long now, but Magnol was 56. So yes, he became counselor to the king, but only after being excluded from science for decades and being forced to renounce his faith. And what's important about this, what's important about Magnol's story is it isn't just Magnol's story, right? Science, like society in which it sits, has always had a diversity problem. Women have been excluded, people of color have been excluded, indigenous peoples have been excluded, and the list goes on. There's been lots of recent progress, but we are not nearly finished opening up science to everyone. And that means that over the centuries and still today, people as brilliant as Magnol are being lost to science. So I like to think about the name Magnolia in two ways. First, it honors Magnol and his contributions to science. But second, it's a reminder for us that other Magnols are not so lucky. And of course, human society can only achieve full potential if we include everyone, right? And so when our magnolias begin to bloom this spring, a little earlier for you than for me, but a couple months away, think about Pierre Magnol, who you may not have known about. And I think it's good to think about the lessons in that name. Well, that's just one example of a story you can find by drilling down into an eponymous name. I'm going to tell you a few more. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I sometimes call ego naming or self-naming. Sometimes when a non-scientist learn about an eponymous name, they suspect that the scientist simply named something after themselves. Interesting enough, many scientists, even many systematists, claim that you aren't allowed to do that. But in fact, there's nothing in the code of nomenclature that says you can't. You are allowed to name something after yourself. Most of us agree it would be tacky, and very few scientists have done it, but not zero. There's 4 names here, and each one I've included the authority, so the person who published the name. And you can see an interesting pattern, right? It's Cartwrightia, Cartwrighti, Cartwright. It's Aphosemnion roloffii, Roloff. It's Rhinoceros jamraki, Jamrak, and so on. These are suspicious looking names. And 2 of these 4 really are cases of people naming things after themselves. It does happen. Not Cartwright. So the Central American scarab beetle in the upper left is Cartwrightia, Cartwrightia, Cartwright. It's named, in fact, by Cartwright. It was named by the American entomologist Oscar Cartwright. Cartwright didn't name it for himself, though. So the genus was named for him. Cartwrightia was named for him by a Mexican entomologist, Federico Islas Salas. The species Cartwrighti was named by Oscar Cartwright about a decade later, but not for himself. He named it for his brother, Raymond Cartwright, who took part in many of his collecting expeditions. So it's arguably clumsy, but it's not ego naming. Roloff isn't guilty either. Believe it or not, Roloff named this fish after himself by accident. So Roloff was a hobbyist. He collected this killifish in Africa in the late 1930s. He brought it back to Germany. He was sure it was a new species, so he sent it off to a museum, the Berlin Museum, to a specialist named Ernst Ahl. Ahl confirmed it really was a new species, and he told Roloff, yeah, I'm going to name it after you, which is very common. Species are often named after the first person to collect it in the wild, or at least the first science-connected person to collect the species. Roloff was thrilled about this, so he wrote an article for the local aquarium hobbyist magazine and used the name Roloffii in that article about this new fish. All that would have been fine, except that Ahl's paper got hung up and delayed in publication. So Roloff's article happened to come out first, and that means that Roloff's is the official naming. So technically he named the fish after himself, but it was an accident. It really was. I'm going to give him a pass. The 2 at the bottom, though, are different. These are scientists who gave in to temptation. Start with the one you never heard of on the left. William Jamrak was an exotic animal dealer and an amateur zoologist. He was working in London in the late 19th century. And in 1874, he imported a live rhino from India. It was actually the one in the print on the left. It's the right-hand animal. It's got a little bit shorter horn. And Jamrak was sure this was not the same as the other rhinos he'd imported. It had a bunch of extra warts and a few more folds of skin, and he thought it was a new species. Professional zoologists didn't agree. They thought it was just a slightly wartier individual of the regular Indian rhino, but this really made Jamrak angry. I mean, how dare they question him? So he published a pamphlet in which he described his rhino as a new species, and he gave it the name Rhinoceros jamraki. Now, and you can wonder, maybe he named it after his father, Charles Jamrak, or his brother, Albert Jamrak. They were both also exotic animal dealers. And Jamrak never quite comes out and says he named it for himself, but it's pretty clear because in the pamphlet, he talks about the skepticism of all the experts, and explaining his decision to name the rhino, he wrote, I stamped my foot and bestowed my blessings on science. And my ambition now is to someday work that sentence into one of my own papers. As it turns out, the professionals were right. Jamrak's rhino was just a slightly wartier than average Indian rhino. Science has thanked William Jamrak for his blessings by forgetting all about him. You have to trace down the name to know anything about this story now. We haven't forgotten Linnaeus, though. It's because of Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, and his naming system that we can name species after people in the first place. There's a long history of this, but before Linnaeus, names had to be descriptive. Linnaeus's very favorite plant was twinflower, this lovely, delicate little flower. It grows in boreal forests in both Europe and North America. He loved it so much when he commissioned his portrait, he had himself painted holding a little sprig of twinflower. And he loved it so much, he named it after himself. So Linnea borealis. Borealis just means north, right? But Linnea, of course, is from Linnaeus. What's interesting about this is not so much that Linnaeus succumbed to temptation and named this plant after himself. What's interesting is he did it and he tried to hide it. And this is what I think is interesting about this story. Linnaeus published the name in 1737 in a book called Genera Plantarum, but with a note, I've circled it in red, indicating that he hadn't coined the name. So instead he credited Gronovio, or Jan Gronovius, an older Dutch botanist, for the name. That would totally make sense. Linnaeus had recently published a different book explaining his philosophy of naming. And he made it clear that naming species was a sacred duty, that naming a species after someone conferred a huge honor, and that you only did that, you only named a species after someone for the very best of reasons. So given that, Linnaeus would have been thrilled to see Gronovius name his favorite species after him, and no one would be surprised to see Linnaeus adopt that name. So it's a great story, it's very plausible, and ever since biographers of Linnaeus have been speculating about whether or not it's actually true. And we can now actually settle this because Linnaeus's manuscripts are now all online. And with a bit of help, I was able to find the smoking gun. And this is it. This is a handwritten manuscript of Linnaeus's from 1730. And here you can see Linnaeus distinguishing two plants, Campanulam. One he's calling Campanulam, one he's calling Linnaeum. So there's that name Linnaeus, not quite finalized yet, but it's there. And in 1730, Linnaeus was a second-year medical student that Gronovius had never met, almost certainly never heard of. There's just no way Gronovius was naming plants after Linnaeus before 1730. There's no way. Gronovius didn't name Linnea. Linnaeus named it, and he faked the attribution to Gronovius, probably because he knew what he was doing wasn't quite kosher. It actually doesn't surprise me that Jamrach and Linnaeus did this, named species after themselves. They were human. All humans wrestle with temptation. All humans occasionally lose. And it's worth remembering that all scientists are human. What surprises me actually is there's so few names like Rhinoceros jamrachii and Linnea borealis. Most of us, most of the time, have been able to resist this particular temptation. It's kind of a loophole, though. Imagine you really wanted to have a species named after yourself. So Stan Blazimski really wanted one. This is Stan Blazimski. He's an American businessman. And he just really liked the idea of being immortalized in a species name, so he paid for one. What that means is he donated about $4,000 to a German research consortium called Biopat. And in exchange, a researcher named this really gorgeous weevil from New Guinea after him. Actually, the bill Stan got from Biopat was actually not $4,000, it was closer to $25,000 because he actually bought names for his whole family. So there's an orchid for his wife, Leslie. There's a frog for his son, Liam, and another one for his daughter, Claudia. There's a lizard for his son, Caden, and there's a moth for his daughter, Magdalene. This is a little chunk of Biopat. That group, the Systematists, and that group have sold naming rights for well over 100 species now. Somebody had an orchid named from Mikhail Gorbachev as a birthday present once. Dozens of people have paid to have species named for themselves. And some taxonomists, to be fair, are really horrified by this. It just seems wrong to some people to commercialize naming. And remember, Linnaeus considered it this sort of sacred duty to be pursued only for the very best of motives. But consider this about Biopat. These naming sales have raised about $1 million, all of which has supported either the research of new species discovery or conservation programs to protect these new species. What's really interesting is that as far as I can discover, and I've looked pretty hard, nobody has ever named a species for personal gain. I said interesting, but that's probably the wrong word. It's not interesting, it's astonishing. You may have noticed that as scientists, you and I rarely get rich, and people are definitely willing to pay for species names. And there's thousands of species being named every year. So there's lots of opportunity here. Sooner or later, somebody is going to succumb to temptation. Somebody's going to name a species for beer money. It's going to be a little bit embarrassing. Now, is that a reason we should stop using names, naming sales to fund species discovery and conservation? I don't think so. Some people do. You can sort of decide for yourselves. But I will admit that there's something that smells just a little bit wrong for some people, for a lot of people, with selling naming rights and with species named for business people who have no connection to biology. So I want to cleanse your palate with a story that everyone I think agrees or will agree is inspirational. It's a story that some of you may probably actually know. It's actually a treat to give this talk to a entomology department, because I give this talks like this fairly often, and no one's ever heard of Maria Sibylla Merian, which is sort of part of the point of her story. Some of you as entomologists may actually know about her. I hope this is a story everyone agrees is inspirational. So these are a few of the species named after Maria Sibylla Merian: a Jamaica rose at the top left, a bulbul lily, and a tegu lizard. I'll talk about the tegu in a bit. Each of them has her name, Merian's name, preserved and on display. They're sort of living memorials to a woman who was completely forgotten for a long time, but who shouldn't have been. These species help to tell her story. As I say, many of you may actually know about Maria Sibylla Merian. For any of you who haven't, I'll tell you a little bit about her. I hope there'll be at least a new detail or two for everyone here. She was born in Frankfurt in 1647. She was an artist, a brilliant naturalist, who made huge advances actually in our understanding of natural history, especially entomology. She was famous in her lifetime, but then she was forgotten for centuries. She's still to this day known mostly to other entomologists. She deserves a lot better than this. Now, in some ways, when she headed down a career path as a naturalist, she had a lot of advantages. She lived at a time when people were fascinated by nature and when weird and wonderful creatures were being brought back to Europe by voyages of discovery and colonization and trade. She was born into a family of printmakers and publishers. They specialized in these lavishly illustrated books of natural history. Her stepfather and her husband were both artists who encouraged her interest in illustration. All this makes it sound like she had it easy. Of course, she didn't. It was the 17th century, and she was a woman. It was one thing for a woman to illustrate plants for her family's press. That was probably okay. It was quite another thing then for a woman to be a naturalist or to pursue her independent interests. But Merian did both of those things. As a teenager, she started to collect caterpillars and to rear them on their host plants to study their metamorphosis into butterflies. That sounds like grade school stuff to us now, because it is, but at the time, almost nothing was known about the life cycles of butterflies. Entomology books at the time illustrated caterpillars and butterflies separately as if they were different species, and many scholars still thought that caterpillars were spontaneously generated from dew. In 1679, Merian published this book. It's called The Wondrous Transformation of Caterpillars, only in German. She observed and painted the whole life cycle from egg to caterpillar to adult. Even the parasitic wasps and tachinids sometimes emerge. There's one at see if I can make the cursor show. Yeah, there's a parasite down here. And she painted these things that emerged instead of the butterflies she expected. And she painted the host plant. So she showed the caterpillar on the plant it depends on, not just sitting on something pretty, which is more common in art at the time. So the Wondrous Transformation established Merian's reputation, both as an artist and a naturalist. And that reputation let her do something almost unheard of in her time, that she left her husband and she moved to the Netherlands to join a commune. The particular sect had a colony in Suriname in South America, and members that were sending butterflies back home. So Merian would have seen some of these species, and she was totally enthralled. But she saw them as dead specimens, and that wasn't enough for her. So in 1699, she left and she sailed for Suriname with only her 21-year-old daughter, Dorothea, to accompany her. And it's really hard to exaggerate just how extraordinary this was. This is 60 years before Captain Cook's Pacific voyages. It's 130 years before Darwin sailed on the Beagle. She landed at a town called Paramaribo. This was the biggest European settlement at the time. It was only a town of 1,000 people, though. Many of them were convicts pressed into military service. You only went there to trade in sugar or in slaves. You didn't go there at all if you were a woman on your own. Marion risked shipwreck and piracy to get there. She risked malaria and the threat of French invasion and a lot more to stay there. But from Paramaribo, she hacked her way into the jungle to collect and paint caterpillars and butterflies and their host plants and parasites, all this stuff. And these paintings would eventually become a book called Metamorphosis of the Insects of Suriname. And it's just a masterpiece. Had 60 plates like these and another 60 pages of her natural history observations. She wasn't the first European scientist to see the tropical rainforest, but she was the first to study living insects there and the first to see those insects as more than just specimens, to study and paint the ecological web of interactions, caterpillars, host plants, parasites together. And not just that, the caterpillars were her passion, but she saw other things too. She saw new wonderful plants. She saw other insects like the ants and katydids here. And she saw predators like lizards and spiders. The print on the left actually became quite controversial. Notice at the bottom left, the tarantula, it's eating a hummingbird. A century after Marion's death, naturalists had decided that her work was careless and riddled with errors, and at least one pointed to this print as evidence of that. I mean, come on, everybody knows spiders don't eat birds, right? Except that they do. And 170 years after Marion painted this, it was Henry Walter Bates who published his observations of the same thing, and Marion was vindicated. Problem was, by the time she was vindicated, she was also just about completely forgotten. By the end of the 19th century, hardly anyone knew who she was or what she had done. And here's where species names come in, preserving her name. Linnaeus named a couple species for her, described some others based only on her paintings. And in 1839, a French zoologist, Dumeril, named the tegu lizard for her. He had no trouble recognizing it from the illustration. He based the description on the painting because it showed the lizard alive better than the specimens he had. And there are a dozen or so species named for Marion, but I really like this one because it represents the breadth of her interest. She saw everything. And it represents the revolutionary way she saw nature as a living web, not just a source of museum specimens. She was one of the first to appreciate that. People often call Alexander Humboldt the first ecologist, but he was still a century in the future. No one's ever deserved the honor of species naming more than Maria Sibylla Marion. It's an honor for Marion. It's not always an honor, not quite. Occasionally, someone names a species not to honor someone, but to insult them. That brings us again to Linnaeus, who invented our system of names, who explained at length that it was a sacred duty to be done only for the purest of motives. Well, hang on. Here's what happened. Linnaeus didn't just invent the system for naming, right? You all know he also invented a new system for classifying plants, as Pierre Magnol had begun 50 years earlier, but Linnaeus had a new system he thought was better. It was based on the reproductive parts, stamens and pistils. Linnaeus' system, all plants with one stamen are in the class Monandria, mono for one and andria for male, and so on. Two stamens, diandria, and so on and so forth. It's a very easy system, very tidy, even captures some of the evolutionary groups we still recognize today. But the way Linnaeus wrote about it was pretty spicy for the time. He wrote about the flower's petals being the bridal bed. He wrote about bee arriving with pollen as the bridegroom, and I won't quote any more of the racy bits, but there was a Prussian botanist named Johann Sigisbach, and he was just scandalized. He thought the way he wrote, the Linnaeus wrote about flowers was way over the top, and he published his opinion that Linnaeus's classification was lewd, and that plants couldn't possibly commit such loathsome harlotry, another phrase we should all work into our papers. Well, Linnaeus wasn't going to take that lying down, but of course, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? Linnaeus's hammer was naming things. So he named a plant after Sigisbach, and this is it. It's Sigisbachia orientalis. Doesn't look like much, which is sort of the point. It's a weedy plant, not very attractive, sticky, scraggly, and with small, ugly flowers. And that last bit would have stung because Linnaeus had argued if you name a plant after someone, it should resemble them in some way. So he named a plant with small, unattractive reproductive organs after Sigisbach. Linnaeus, brilliant botanist, also Linnaeus, wielder of the schoolyard taunt. Linnaeus was not the last person to do this. It's not common, but he wasn't the last. We have time later. You can ask me about Donald Trump's moth, for example. There are other cases like this out there, but I'll leave this behind for now because Sigisbachia and other insult names are kind of funny, but they're childish too. Yes, as scientists, we can be childish. I'm sure no one's shocked by that. We can also be better than that. So I want you to meet a couple of spiders named for love. They're both, as it turns out, from Sri Lanka, no particular reason. Even if you're a big spider devotee, they may not, maybe not the most gorgeous spiders in the world, but look at their names. On the left, Tamaris Manoj Kausalya, my PhD student, Alacia Arashji, that's her on the very left, named the spider after her husband, Manoj Kausalya. On the right, Grimius Dharmapriya, it's a member of a family called the goblin spiders. If you turn it over, it has a plate, a skeletal plate on the underside, which is heart-shaped. It was named by another young spider scientist, Sasanka Rangasinga, on the far right, after her husband. And excuse me. So named by Sasanka after her husband, who's also in the picture there. Her name is Prasanna Dharmapriya. These spiders are Valentines, or Valentines only a scientist can give. These are spiders named for love, and there's nothing better than love. I'd like to leave it there with spiders for love, and also, by the way, you might notice with some evidence of our progress in diversifying science. But I can't leave it here because eponymous names could be wonderful like this, but they can be problematic too, and we really ought to think about that. Problem is that sometimes a species gets named for someone that we might decide doesn't really deserve the honor that Linnaeus said came with eponymy, and we get stuck with unfortunate names. I'll mention a couple. First of all, Cuvier's gazelle, named for the French anatomist Georges Cuvier, obviously, 1841. Cuvier was an extremely important scientist. He made huge contributions to zoology and paleontology. He was also one of the founders of scientific racism. He published work that claimed to establish the inferiority of non-European peoples. In 1841, Cuvier's racism wasn't, sadly, very unusual. We now understand, or ought to, that it was both evil and wrong. So should we still have his name attached to this lovely gazelle? This is Trigonopterus watsoniana. It doesn't even give us the, well, back in his day it was different excuse. This weevil was named for James Watson in 2019, long after we all, I hope, came to understand that Watson is not just a co-discoverer of DNA structure, but also a sexist and racist ass. Did I say that out loud? I might have said it out loud. Worst of all, this is Anophthalmos hitleri. It's a Slovenian cave beetle. It was named in 1933. Well, you know who it was named for. It was named by an amateur entomologist named Oscar Scheibel, and people have speculated that Scheibel was only doing what you had to do then. He was showing pro forma allegiance to the Fuhrer. Unfortunately, that's not true. If you read the paper carefully, there's no doubt that Scheibel really was a Nazi and an admirer of Hitler, and this poor beetle is stuck with this name. So what should we do? There are periodic calls to amend the nomenclatural code. Well, that didn't work well. Oh well, I'm stuck with it. Periodic calls to amend the code so you can change the names. Question is, should we? It's not an easy question. Any attempt to answer is going to be controversial. There are three options I can think of. I want to go through this pretty quickly because I know our time is limited here. The first option, to name species for good people but not for bad ones, sounds really tempting. And there are proposals to change the code so we can actually do this, to purge existing names for bad people. It would only work if we could sort humans into two tidy boxes, good people and bad ones. And you know where that leads. It leads to this weird hagiography where people, we try really hard to keep someone in our good box until evidence mounts to some transgression. Then we move them into the bad box and all pile on and smear them. This is, if you're on social media, you've seen this play out in the last month or so for E.O. Wilson and also for Ernst Mayr. And that's naive. Nobody fits entirely in the good box. Almost nobody fits entirely in the bad box. So I don't think we can do this. I don't think we can sort people out this way. So that's why I've crossed out the first option in red. The second is you just quit, stop using eponymous naming altogether. And there are people advocating exactly that. It's a reasonable position. You could say it's a conservative one, avoiding all possible unpleasantness. It's not my position because it comes with costs too, especially for me. It robs us of this opportunity to teach and to learn from these stories. They're flagged by eponymous names. And I see every name as a story with as a loose thread with a story attached. You can pull on it and you can learn sometimes about Cuvier, both his insights and his racism, sometimes about Maria Sibylla Merian, sometimes about Pierre Magdal and the discrimination he faced. So I'd like to see us continue to use these names, basing them on as diverse as possible set of people. But I'd like us to do it with the understanding that scientists are human. And so are the people that name species for, and that all humans are flawed. In fact, their flaws with their virtues are what make them human. So I'd like us to think about naming as a system. And as a system, it has costs. We get some problematic names like this Watson eye weevil, but it also has benefits for teaching and for learning. And just very quickly, I want to end with one more little loose thread to reinforce this idea of names as a way we can learn. And that is this animal, the smallest living primate, Microcephalus berthi, Madame Berth's mouse lemur. These live only in a small bit of dry forest in the west coast of Madagascar. Like most of that country's fauna, they're severely endangered. When I first met this lemur and its name, I wondered who Bertha was. Well, it turns out this is her. This is Dr. Bertha Rakotasibiamanana. She was a primatologist. She was born in a small village in Madagascar. She came to be a leader in science and conservation in that country. She taught for over 30 years at the University of Antananarivo. She founded departments of paleontology, anthropology. She taught hundreds of students. She arranged permits and connections so foreign researchers could come to Madagascar under its isolationist Marxist government, and she set it up for them to work with and train local students. More than anyone else, she built the strong cohort of local zoologists and conservationists that are the best hope for Microcephalus berthi and the rest of that country's flora and fauna. And she was funny too. The lemur was named for her in 2001, about 4 years before she died. And she was a very short woman, but stout. And her colleagues tell stories about her pointing to a picture of her lemur and saying, you know, the smallest primate in the world, and then pausing as she would sort of look down at herself. I think I would have liked her very much. I certainly like knowing about her. And this kind of thing, the stories are what I find fascinating about scientific names. And I hope you might find them fascinating too. Some do honor real heroes. Some do show scientists succumbing to temptation, like the human creatures that all of us are. I think they're all worth learning about. You can learn a lot more about Madame Berth and about hundreds of others in the book if you like. You can Google my blog to find it, or just order a copy. My publisher makes me say that part. And I know we don't have much time left for questions, but I hope we have time for some. And so, Brock, will you sort of moderate those, I guess?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you. This is really a fun talk. I'm getting text messages of people saying that they're really enjoying it. So this is great. As the questions filter in, I'm going to ask one that I'm sure you're going to get. You get every time you give this talk, which is, have you heard of this species? So I hope you include in your book or saw Spencer Monkton's Chilicola charizard. I said charizard very incorrectly. And Jason Gibbs' Lasioglossum is awesome. The two Torontonian bees that were, well, actually one of them's from Chile, but I hope you spotted those and included them.
So the first one's a Pokemon, right?
Correct. Yeah. Spencer is a naturalist because of Pokemon.
So sadly, that one's not in the book. I couldn't put everything in. And it's not. But there is a chapter on names from fiction, in which I cover, for example, a couple of spiders named Aragog, and other things like that. And there are a number of names, eponymous names based on fictional characters, which are quite interesting. But sadly, not that one.
So, okay, thanks for that. There are a few questions here. So Matthew has one in the chat, in the Q&A, pardon me. And Matthew's curious, says, you mentioned that while Marion was alive, many people believe that caterpillars spontaneously generated from dew. I'm curious, did Marion understand the parasitism she saw in her butterfly rearing, or did she believe that they were an alternate form?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Parasitoids were a really new thing at that point, and because people really hadn't done these careful rearings of things all through the life cycle. And so she painted them. She knew they were a thing, but I'd have to read her in the original German, unfortunately, to know for sure.
Thanks.
Sorry.
So there's a few coming in chat. I will start at the bottom here. So Javier, great presentation. On average, how many new species are discovered / named each year?
That is surprisingly hard to figure out, because what we don't have is a single repository for names. A name, it becomes official, quote unquote, when it's published, and there are some rules about where it can be published, but there isn't any registry. And so it's quite challenging. The number is certainly thousands, but there's no easy way to figure out what it is. That was quite a challenge actually doing research for the book too, because there isn't there's no single big database you can just search. There are for particular taxa. There's AVA-based for birds and fish-based for fish and things like that. But for others there isn't, so it's quite a challenge.
Yeah, that's certainly challenging. Oh God, Fred Whitford. I like this one. What happens if I don't want my name used?
Sigisbeck would have been in that category. He apparently was quite pleased when he first heard about this, and then discovered what the plant was like, and was not pleased. You wouldn't actually have much recourse, as it turns out. Under the rules of naming, there's no requirement for the person who the plant is named for to consent to that. There's a great story I talk about in the book about a pair of Swedish paleontologists in the between the wars, I think, who were naming fossils for each other. They hated each other. She was, I'll take sides. She was a Jewish woman and he was a Nazi. And they were naming species after each other, and neither one of them was very happy about it. And it was funny because they were so passive aggressive. They would dedicate the species to each other using these flowery words about, in recognition of the person's kindly supplying me with specimens, but then they'd name the thing. The names for her are different versions of fat, because she was big, and her names for him are hilarious, because she turns sort of Nazi horrible beliefs about phrenology and all kinds of things back on them, and names things for him in ways that make very clear Wow, it's a long story. You can read about it in the book, but clearly neither of them was a voluntary participant. I would never name something for someone without getting their permission. Although it's not infrequent now for someone to name something after someone as a surprise and not tell them until the name is published. Of course, usually you would have some reason to hope or to know they would be pleased. I think it would be classy to get permission. That's especially true. Increasingly, we see namings that use indigenous languages, or sometimes indigenous names. And depending on the culture, for example, in Maori culture, using the name of a deceased person is very offensive. And so you want to be very careful about doing things like that. I think permission is an awfully good thing.
It's a really
Thanks, Fred.
Great take. Katie has one here in the Q&A, and it's, do you have something named after you? And I'm going to add on to that as well. If so, do you agree, disagree? Do you like it?
I don't. To my knowledge, because the literature is so fragmented, no, I don't have anything named after me. Look, as you can tell, I like these names. I would be thrilled, and I wouldn't care what it was. Give me a diving beetle with tiny genitalia, as someone has said in the chat. Give me a slug. Gary Larson has a louse, and I talk about that in the book, and he was thrilled with his louse. I'd be up for a louse, whatever. No, it hasn't happened. It's sad.
So I think that's it for the questions. This has been a really great talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been awesome. We do have 1 minute left, so folks have that one last pressing question. Now would be the time to get it in there. Otherwise, Steve will be at, let me just pull up your schedule, grad student lunch with the entomology students up next, and then the biology students a little bit after that. So you can definitely chat with them there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that if I can, Brock. I'm easy to find. I don't have my email on here, but just Google me. I'm easy to find. Poke me on Twitter or send me an email. I'd be happy to answer a question later on.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you again. This was really fun.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for hosting. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.